The Dark Watcher. In the heart of a forgotten town, nestled among thickets that whispered secrets of old, stood a house as ancient as the hills. It was a peculiar structure, with windows that seemed to flicker with unseen eyes and walls that hummed with silent histories. This house, known to the locals only as the Havenwood Residence, had stood empty for years, its stories and its specters locked away, until the Marsden family decided to call it home. The beginning was innocent enough. The Marsdens, consisting of Helen and George, along with their children, Lily and Noah, were charmed by the house's Victorian eccentricity in the sprawling land it sat on. They laughed off the warnings of the townsfolk, attributing their tales of the supernatural to rural superstition. However, they would soon learn that some legends grow from seeds of truth. The unsettling occurrences began with phenomena so subtle and minute that they could almost be brushed aside as figments of the imagination. Objects, once left in certain spots, would inexplicably find themselves relocated, as if by an unseen hand. Doors, previously left ajar or securely open, would shut silently without any discernible cause, as though moved by whispers of the wind that no one could feel. The nights, previously warm and comforting in their embrace, began to exude an eerie chill that seeped into the bones, making the air within the house feel unnaturally cold, a coldness that no amount of heating seemed to dispel. Helen, ever the optimist and inclined to find humor in the face of the inexplicable, would often laugh off these oddities, attributing them to the house's unique character. She liked to say that their new home simply had its own set of quirks, a personality as it were, jesting that it was their house's way of getting to know them. George, on the other hand, was a man grounded in the tangible and the explainable. He approached these peculiar events with a sense of practicality, convinced there had to be rational explanations for everything they were experiencing. Perhaps the house was settling, he mused, or there were drafts they hadn't yet discovered. He spent countless hours examining the foundation, checking windows, and looking for any logical reason that could account for these phenomena. However, despite his exhaustive searches and attempts to rationalize the happenings, no satisfactory explanations presented themselves. The phenomena remained, as enigmatic as ever, defying logical understanding and leaving a lingering question mark hanging over the Marsden family's heads. The children, with their sensitivity to the unseen and unexplained, were the unwitting pioneers in detecting the ominous presence that had begun to permeate their new home. Lily, whose mind was a fertile ground for the seeds of imagination, frequently spoke of an eerie man in the walls. She described him as a shadowy figure, formless yet distinct, who seemed to observe her with an intense curiosity from the crevices and shadows of her bedroom each night. Her vivid descriptions painted a chilling picture of an entity that lurked just beyond the veil of visibility, always watching, always present. Noah, who prided himself on his logical and rational perspective, initially dismissed his sister's stories as the product of an overactive imagination. He teased her, attributing her nighttime visitor to dreams and a natural fear of the dark that he believed all children experienced at some point. However, his skepticism began to erode under the weight of his own encounters. It was subtle at first, the inexplicable feeling of being observed, which he could almost convince himself was nothing more than his mind playing tricks. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, more oppressive, as if an unseen set of eyes were constantly fixed upon him, observing his every move with an intensity that could be felt in the very air. This feeling reached a crescendo one night as he lay in bed, the shadows of his room seeming to pulsate with a life of their own. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation, as if something unseen was about to manifest. It was then that Noah, the ever-skeptical and rational thinker, felt a cold dread wash over him. The shadows appeared to coalesce into a darker form, an embodiment of the ominous presence that Lily had spoken of. Though no words were spoken, and no eyes were visible in the consuming darkness, the message was clear: they were not alone. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, and for the first time, Noah understood the terrifying truth behind Lily's tales. This was no figment of imagination, this was a haunting reality, a presence that defied explanation and filled their nights with an ever-growing sense of dread. The entity, which the children had unwittingly named the Watcher, grew bolder with its manifestations. Whispered voices filled the corridors at night, speaking in tongues that twisted the air. The family's pets refused to enter the house, and wildlife steered clear of the property. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere settled over Havenwood, suffocating in its intensity. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the true horror of their situation became undeniably clear. The power had gone out, plunging the house into darkness, save for the occasional flicker of lightning. It was then, in the pitch black, that they heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping, coming from the walls. Panic set in as the tapping grew louder, more urgent. The family huddled together in the living room, the only source of light a feeble candle that flickered as if frightened. The air grew colder, breaths visible in the candlelight, and the feeling of being watched intensified. In the heart of an already tense and fear-laden evening, the Marsden family found themselves clustered together, their only source of comfort and visibility being the small, flickering flame of a solitary candle. This fragile light served as their bastion against the encroaching darkness of the house, a darkness that felt alive, pregnant with malevolent intent. Suddenly, as if snatched by an invisible force, the candlelight was extinguished, casting the room into an abyss of black. The abrupt plunge into complete darkness was not just a physical one, it felt as though they were also being submerged into the very depths of fear itself. The rhythmic tapping that had been echoing within the walls, a sinister Morse code that had set their nerves on edge, abruptly ceased. In its place, a silence descended upon the room, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. This was not the silence of peace or calm, it was a chilling, anticipatory quiet, the kind that precedes the storm, filled with the electricity of imminent dread. Out of this oppressive silence, a voice emerged. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the very foundations of the house and into the core of their beings. The voice spoke in a language that was not meant for human ears, its words twisted and foreign, yet dripping with an unmistakable malice that transcended the barrier of understanding. The very air seemed to thicken with its hatred, wrapping around the family like a suffocating shroud. This entity, this watcher in the darkness, had up until now contented itself with mere observation, a predator enjoying the fear its presence instilled in its prey. But now, it sought more. The voice, the extinguishing of light, and the sinister cessation of the tapping were all declarations of its intent. It was no longer satisfied with merely lurking in the shadows, it desired to make its presence undeniably known. It wanted the Marsdens to feel its gaze, to know that it was there with them, sharing the space, invading their sanctuary. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it had become a tangible manifestation of their deepest fears, a herald of the realization that they were not alone. This presence, this malevolent watcher, had finally stepped out from the shadows, making clear its terrifying desire for more than just observation. In a desperate act, George attempted to confront the entity, shouting into the darkness, demanding it reveal itself. What followed was a laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves, mocking, sinister. The terror reached its peak when, in a flash of lightning, the figure of a man appeared among them, his features obscured by shadow, save for two gleaming eyes that burned with an unholy light. The sight was so horrifying, so otherworldly, that it paralyzed them with fear. In a fleeting moment, the sinister figure that had momentarily materialized among them, a manifestation of their deepest fears made flesh, dissolved back into the shadows from whence it came. Its disappearance, rather than offering solace, seemed to cast a pall of even greater dread over the Marsden family. The echoing silence left in its wake was not one of absence but felt charged with a malevolent watchfulness, as if the very atmosphere of the house had been poisoned by its presence. With hearts hammering against their chests and a cold grip of fear encircling their minds, the Marsdens knew they could no longer remain within these cursed walls. The decision was made in a silent consensus, a desperate, instinctual drive to escape, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the malevolent entity that had invaded their home. They moved as one, a family united by terror, rushing towards the front door, their movements hurried and frantic. But as they reached for freedom, a force beyond their understanding or control manifested with a violent suddenness. Doors slammed shut with thunderous finality, windows that once offered views to the outside world now sealed themselves, as if by an invisible, impenetrable force. The very structure of the house seemed to conspire against them, transforming from a sanctuary into a prison in the blink of an eye. The realization that they were trapped, that every avenue of escape had been cut off by an unseen will, descended upon them with the weight of a tombstone. Panic, raw and unyielding, clawed at their throats, a palpable entity in its own right, feeding on their fear. They tested doors and windows in a frenzy, throwing themselves against the barriers with a desperation born of absolute terror, but it was futile. The house, or the entity that now claimed dominion over it, held them fast within its grasp. This was no longer a simple haunting or a case of paranormal activity. The malevolent presence had made its intentions clear. Not only did it seek to terrify, but to imprison, to keep them within its domain of darkness. The realization that their home had become a cell, and they the unwilling inmates at the mercy of an inescapable and incomprehensible power, struck them with a horror that eclipsed all they had experienced thus far. They were not merely witnesses to the supernatural, they had become its captives, ensnared by forces beyond their understanding, their pleas for mercy swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence that now ruled over Havenwood Residence. As the Marsden family's cries echoed unheard within the confines of their living nightmare, a shadow moved in the darkness outside. This shadow belonged to Thomas, a longtime resident of the village, who had kept a watchful eye on the Havenwood Residence from afar. He knew of the house's dark history, of the entity that lurked within its walls, a secret passed down through generations. Tonight, his worst fears had been realized as he witnessed the lights flicker and heard the distant sounds of terror emanating from the old house. Thomas, unlike most, refused to turn a blind eye to the Marsdens' plight. Armed with nothing but his resolve and a pack of vehicle flares he kept for emergencies, he made his way towards the ominous silhouette of Havenwood. Each step was heavy with the weight of uncertainty, but the screams that pierced the night air propelled him forward. Upon reaching the house, Thomas could feel the malevolence that emanated from its very foundations. It was as if the air itself was charged with a sinister energy, repelling him. Yet, he pressed on, striking a flare to life. Its bright, red light sliced through the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows and painting the scene in a surreal glow. The entity, so used to dwelling in the darkness, recoiled from the sudden burst of light. Thomas, with a courage born of desperation, advanced, using the flare to carve a path through the oppressive darkness. He circled to the front of the house, where the door remained obstinately sealed, a barrier between the Marsdens and their freedom. With another flare ignited, Thomas approached the front door. The light seemed to weaken the unseen force holding it shut, the darkness retreating like a tide pulling away from the shore. Emboldened, Thomas banged on the door, his voice a rallying cry for the trapped family, "You can get out now. Go, go." Inside, the Marsdens, drawn to the promise of salvation that the light represented, gathered their remaining shreds of courage. With a collective effort, fueled by a surge of hope, they pushed against the door. This time, it gave way, swinging open to reveal the night, lit by the flare's defiant glow. The family spilled out onto the porch, tears streaming down their faces, sobbing with relief and terror in equal measure. They didn't stop to look back or to gather their belongings. Nothing mattered but the escape from the nightmare that their home had become. Thomas, with a watchful eye on the shadows that lurked just beyond the reach of the light, ushered them away from the house. The flares, now dwindling, continued to hold the darkness at bay just long enough for them to make their escape. As they fled into the night, leaving behind the Havenwood residence and its horrors, the house seemed to sigh, a sound of thwarted malice that faded into the silence of the night. The Marsdens never returned, their home abandoned once more, but the legend of that night, and the bravery of a villager who stood against the darkness, would live on in whispered tales, a warning to all who might forget the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the world. Dare to venture into the unknown. Join us on a journey where shadows whisper and secrets lurk. Subscribe now and ring the bell to summon fresh mysteries directly to your screen every few days. Ignore this call, and be warned, an eternal curse awaits those who wander in the dark, unguided. Do you have the courage to face the unknown? Your adventure begins with a click. Welcome to the realm where every notification brings you closer to the abyss. Subscribe, if you dare.